Federalist 46, Part 3. We'll start with paragraph 7. Again, Madison reminds the readers that federal government will not get that powerful to push the state governments away. And in this paper, he actually goes as far as saying that if federal government becomes violent and wants to take away your freedoms, take away the freedoms of the people, people of America are freedom-loving, just like they stood up to the British. They revolted and destroyed the British in America. They will destroy a federal government that would be too abusive and too tyrannical. So he keeps on talking about how people will be attached to their states first, and that's what history has taught us. But let's say sometime in the future the federal government somehow becomes too powerful and wants to act tyrannical. He says people of America will stand up and crush it. So I'll continue with paragraph 7. Where it admitted, however, that the federal government may feel an equal disposition with the state governments to extend its powers beyond the due limits, the latter would still have the advantage in the means of defeating such encroachments. If an act of a particular state, though unfriendly to the national government, be generally popular in the state, and should not too grossly violate the oaths of the state officers, it is executed immediately and, of course, by means on the spot and depending on the state alone. The opposition of the federal government or the interposition of the federal officers would but inflame the zeal of all parties on the side of the state, and the evil could not be prevented or repaired, if at all, without the employment of means which must always be resorted to with reluctance and difficulty. He's talking about arms. You'll reluctantly get to it, but if it happens, you'll do it. American people will do it. On the other hand, should an unwarrantable measure of the federal government be unpopular in particular states, which would seldom fail to be the case, or even a warrantable measure be so, which may sometimes be the case, and the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand, that this quietude of the people, their repugnance and perhaps refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union, the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state, the embarrassments created by legislative devices. Embarrassments here means the blocks, things that might block the federal government's actions by legislative devices, but by the state legislatures, which would often be added on such occasions, would oppose in any state difficulties not to be despised, would form in a large state very serious impediments, and where the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in unison, would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So if it's a small state can stand up to the federal government by legislative actions, by different methods. If it's a larger state, they could use other means. If federal government gets out of hand, wants to do something and overreach its authority in several states, even if it's in a region, those states can unite and stand up to the federal government. Okay, paragraph 8. But ambitious encroachments of the federal government on the authority of the state governments would not excite the opposition of a single state or of a few states only. They would be signals of general alarm. Every government would espouse the common cause. A correspondence would be opened. Plans of resistance would be concerted. One spirit would animate and conduct the whole. So he says, look, if federal government wants to abuse his authority, all of the states will line up. And just like we did in the revolution, we'll start committees of correspondence. We'll be in correspondence with each other. We will unite. We'll put a common front. So he's saying, don't worry. Federal government is not going to be crazy enough to overstep its bounds like that. The same combinations, in short, would result from an apprehension of the federal, as was produced by the dread of a foreign yoke. Just like we stood up when the British wanted to enslave us, we're going to stand up to the federal government if the time comes. And unless the projected innovations should be voluntarily renounced, the same appeal to a trial of force would be made in the one case as was made in the other. But what degree of madness could ever drive the federal government to such an extremity? In the contest with Great Britain, one part of the empire was employed against the other. The more numerous part invaded the rights of the less numerous part. The attempt was unjust and unwise, but it was not, in speculation, absolutely chimerical. Remember, I told you the word chimerical, something that's illusory and impossible, a fantasy. But what would be the contest in the case we are supposing? Who would be the parties? A few representatives of the people would be opposed to the people themselves, or rather one set of the representatives would be contending against 13 sets of representatives. He's talking about one government, one federal government would be against 13 governments. These 13 governments will stand up to it if the time comes, if the federal government becomes crazy enough to do that. So a few representatives of the people would be opposed to the people themselves, or rather one set of representatives would be contending against 13 sets of representatives, with the whole body of the common constituents on the side of the latter. So paragraph 9 is going to be long, so I'll read part of it here. The only refuge left for those who prophesy the downfall of the state governments in the visionary supposition that the federal government may previously accumulate a military force for the projects of ambition, the reasonings contained in these papers must have been employed to little purpose indeed, if it could be necessary now to disprove the reality of this danger, that the people and the states should, for a sufficient period of time, elect an uninterrupted succession of men ready to betray both, that the traitors should throughout this period uniformly and systematically pursue some fixed plan of the extension of the military establishment, that the governments and the people of the states should silently and patiently behold the gathering storm and continue to supply materials until it should be prepared to burst on their own heads, must appear to everyone more likely the incoherent dreams of a delirious jealousy or the misjudged exaggerations of a counterfeit zeal than like the sober apprehensions of genuine patriotism. So he says, Do you think people will continue back to back to elect people that will betray them, that will actually give the federal government enough power and materials and money and time to organize and crush the people's freedom and liberty? He says this is a fantasy. You mean a few election cycles will happen and nobody will know that these people are making plans to take our freedoms away? That the federal government is going to take our freedoms away? Our own representatives are going to be such traitors that will not be looking after our well-being? He says this is crazy. Okay, I will continue in the next video, the middle of this paragraph 9.